I walked through the security checkpoint at the Arlington facility with no idea why I'd been summoned. The call had come in at 6 that morning. Emergency consultation, classified briefing. Be there by 10. No details, just an address and a clearance code that got me past 3 different checkpoints. The elevator took me to a floor that wasn't marked on the button panel. A woman in a navy suit led me down a hallway lined with identical doors, each bearing nothing but a number. She stopped at conference room 7 and gestured me inside. The room was exactly what I expected from a government facility. Beige walls, a long table surrounded by black leather chairs, and that particular smell of industrial carpet and recycled air. 5 people were already seated, 4 in suits that screamed federal bureaucracy, and 1 who looked completely out of place. The out-of-place guy sat hunched over a coffee cup, his calloused hands wrapped around it like he was trying to absorb its warmth. He had to be in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair that needed a trim and the kind of weathered face that came from years of outdoor work. But it was his eyes that caught my attention when he glanced up, hollow and haunted in a way that made my stomach tighten. "Dr. Thompson, thank you for coming on such short notice." The woman at the head of the table stood to shake my hand. "I'm Deputy Director Catherine Mills. These are my colleagues from various agencies." She didn't bother with individual introductions, which told me this meeting operated on a need-to-know basis. I took the empty chair across from the weathered man, setting my briefcase on the table. "This is Bill Anderson," Mills continued, nodding toward the haunted-eyed man. "He's a contractor who recently completed a project for us." Bill looked up again, and I caught the slight tremor in his hands as he reached for his coffee. The guy was barely holding it together. That much was obvious. Whatever had happened to him, it had shaken him to his core. "Mr. Anderson's project was terminated 3 weeks ago due to circumstances we need your expertise to evaluate," Mills said. "Your background in underground geological phenomena makes you uniquely qualified for this consultation." I leaned back in my chair, studying the faces around the table. Every official looked tense, like they were sitting on something explosive. Bill just stared at the wood grain of the table, occasionally taking small sips from his cup. "What kind of project are we talking about?" I asked. "Tunneling operation in Arizona," Mills replied. "Deep vertical shafts. The work progressed normally for several weeks until we encountered complications." The way she said complications made it clear this wasn't about equipment failures or budget overruns. I'd consulted on dozens of underground projects over the years, cave-ins, gas leaks, structural problems, but the atmosphere in this room felt different, charged with something I couldn't identify. Bill shifted in his seat and spoke for the first time, his voice barely above a whisper. "Some things shouldn't be disturbed underground." The words hung in the air like smoke. Mills exchanged glances with her colleagues, and I noticed one of them, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, take notes on a legal pad. "Dr. Thompson," Mills continued, "we need a scientific assessment of what occurred at the Arizona site. Mr. Anderson and his crew experienced several incidents that forced us to shut down the operation immediately." I looked across the table at Bill, who had gone back to staring at the wood grain. His hands were definitely shaking now, and I could see a muscle twitching in his jaw. Whatever had happened in Arizona, it had broken something inside this man. "The project details are classified," Mills said, "but we can share relevant information for your analysis. Mr. Anderson has agreed to provide a full account of the incidents." Bill's coffee cup rattled against the table as he set it down. He looked up at me with those hollow eyes, and I saw something there that made my chest tighten. Genuine terror. "I need you to understand," he said, his voice stronger now but still shaky. "I've been working underground for 30 years. Tunnels, mines, subway systems. I thought I'd seen everything." He paused, running a hand through his unkempt hair. I was wrong. The silence that followed was heavy with anticipation. Mills opened a folder in front of her, and I caught a glimpse of incident reports and medical documents. Whatever Bill was about to tell us, the government had been documenting it carefully. "Before we begin," Mills said, I need to emphasize the sensitive nature of this information. Everything discussed in this room is classified at the highest levels. I nodded, though my mind was racing. In 20 years of consulting work, I'd never been called into a briefing like this. Underground projects had risks, everyone knew that. Cave-ins, toxic gases, structural failures. But the way these people were acting suggested something far outside the normal range of geological hazards. Bill straightened in his chair, taking a deep breath like he was preparing for something painful. The officials arranged their papers and activated a recording device. The red light blinked steadily, capturing whatever Bill was about to reveal. I realized this wasn't going to be a typical consultation about soil composition or rock stability. Something had happened in the Arizona desert that had spooked a veteran contractor and an entire team of federal officials, and they wanted my scientific expertise to make sense of it. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut as Bill prepared to tell his story. I gripped my pen, ready to take notes, but something in his expression warned me that what I was about to hear would challenge everything I understood about underground construction and safety protocols. Bill cleared his throat and placed both hands flat on the table, as if steadying himself against what he was about to say. The red light on the recording device blinked steadily, and I could hear the subtle hum of the ventilation system in the otherwise silent room. The contract came through in early March, he began, his voice stronger now that he'd committed to telling the story. 12-week project, deep vertical boring in the Arizona desert, about 60 miles northeast of Phoenix, way out in the middle of nowhere. I pulled out my notebook and started taking notes, watching Bill's face as he spoke. His weathered features had settled into a more professional expression, the kind contractors wore when discussing technical specifications with clients. Location was completely isolated, he continued. No roads leading in except for a single access route they'd built specifically for the project. No civilian access for miles in any direction. The whole area was restricted airspace. Mills and her colleagues listened without interruption, occasionally glancing at their own files. I noticed the thin man with wire-rimmed glasses was writing everything down, even though the recording device captured every word. My crew was 12 guys, all experienced in deep boring operations. Every single one of them had to sign additional secrecy agreements on top of the standard government contracts. They wouldn't even tell us what we were drilling for, just gave us depth specifications and geological surveys. Bill reached for his coffee cup, and I watched his hands. The tremor was less noticeable now that he was focused on the factual details, but it was still there. He took a small sip before continuing. The equipment was state-of-the-art, better than anything I'd worked with in 30 years of contracting. They flew it in on military transport helicopters piece by piece. Took us a week just to assemble everything and run the initial tests. I found myself drawn into his account. This sounded like standard government contracting work, the kind of classified infrastructure projects that happened all over the country. But the atmosphere in the room suggested we were building toward something far more disturbing. First month went exactly according to plan, Bill said, and I noticed his posture was more upright now, his voice carrying the confidence of someone discussing work he understood completely. Desert heat was brutal, 110 degrees most days, but we'd worked in worse conditions. The geological surveys were accurate, mostly solid rock with some softer sediment layers. Nothing unusual. He paused, staring at a spot on the table between his hands. My boys worked in rotating shifts, 8-hour rotations, 3 teams. The shafts went down deep. We're talking 400-500 feet minimum, some pushing toward 800. Narrow openings, just wide enough for one person with equipment. Minimal lighting down there, just what each worker carried, plus some emergency floods at regular intervals. The professional tone was slipping now. I could hear it in the way his voice began to waver slightly, the way his fingers drummed against the table. About 4 weeks in, the guys started mentioning weird acoustics in the tunnels. Sound didn't behave the way it should. Voices would echo strange, sometimes seeming to come from below when someone was calling down from above. Tools being dropped would make sounds that seemed to travel the wrong direction. Bill's hands were moving more now, gesturing as he spoke, but the tremor was becoming more pronounced. I figured it was just the rock formations. You get unusual acoustic properties in certain geological conditions. Plus, the guys were stressed. Working that deep in such tight spaces, the isolation, the heat, it gets to people. Mills shifted in her seat, and I caught her exchanging a quick glance with one of her colleagues. Whatever Bill was building toward, they'd heard this part before. But the reports kept coming. Bill continued, his professional demeanor starting to crack. Different guys on different shifts, all describing the same thing. Sounds that didn't make sense. Echoes that seemed to come from sections of tunnel that hadn't been drilled yet. I stopped writing and looked up at him. The hollow expression was creeping back into his eyes. Then they started saying the sounds weren't just echoes. They were hearing things that sounded like voices. Whispers coming from deeper sections of the tunnel system. Bill's voice had dropped to almost a whisper itself, and I had to lean forward to hear him clearly. I went down myself to check. Thought maybe there was equipment malfunction or airflow issues creating noise, but I heard it too. The silence in the room was complete except for the ventilation system and the soft sound of the wire-rimmed man's pen scratching across his legal pad. Whispers, Bill repeated, his hands now visibly shaking as he gripped his coffee cup. Coming from parts of the tunnel we hadn't even reached yet. Sound like voices having conversations in the darkness below. I set my pen down, studying his face. The professional contractor was gone completely now, replaced by the haunted man I'd first seen when I entered the room. I told myself it was just wind, air pressure changes, maybe gas emissions creating noise through the rock formations. Had to be a natural explanation. But even as he said it, I could see in his expression that he hadn't believed his own explanation. Not really. Something in the way his shoulders hunched forward, the way he avoided eye contact with anyone around the table. The whispers got clearer over the next few days. Not louder, but more distinct. Like whatever was making them was getting closer to the surface. Bill rubbed his face with both hands, the gesture of someone trying to scrub away memories that wouldn't fade. The recording device continued its steady blinking as he prepared to move deeper into his account. 3 weeks in, things got worse, he said, his voice taking on a flatter, more mechanical tone. Jose Garcia. He was one of my most reliable guys. 39 years old, 15 years of tunnel experience. Never missed a radio check, never cut corners on safety protocols. I watched Bill's hands as he spoke. They'd moved from gripping his coffee cup to drumming nervously against the table surface, the tremor more pronounced now. Jose was doing a routine inspection in the deepest section we'd completed, maybe 400 feet down, checking for structural integrity and equipment placement. Standard procedure. Radio contact every 15 minutes. Emergency protocols in place if anything went wrong. Mills leaned forward slightly in her chair, and I caught the subtle tension in her posture. Whatever Bill was about to describe, the officials had heard this part before, but it still affected them. 20 minutes passed without contact, Bill continued. Then 30. Protocol said 15 minutes maximum between check-ins. My surface coordinator tried raising him on the radio. Nothing but static. Bill paused, staring at the conference table's wood grain. His jaw muscle was twitching again, and I noticed he'd started breathing a little faster. We lowered emergency lighting into the shaft, portable floods on cables, enough illumination to see the entire bottom section. That's when we spotted him. The wire-rimmed man's pen had stopped moving across his legal pad. Even the soft scratching sound had ceased, leaving only the ventilation system humming in the background. Jose was curled up in the corner of the work area, maybe 10 feet from where he should have been conducting his inspection, rocking back and forth like, Bill's voice caught, like a scared kid. I set my pen down, studying Bill's expression. The professional contractor mask was completely gone now, replaced by something raw and vulnerable. I went down myself, put on the safety gear, Took the emergency radio, descended the whole 400 feet to get him. The climb down felt longer than usual. Something about the way sound was carrying, the way my breathing echoed in the shaft. Bill's hands had stopped drumming and were now pressed flat against the table, as if he needed to anchor himself to something solid. Found Jose exactly where the lights had shown him, still rocking, mumbling to himself. His eyes were wide open, but he wasn't looking at me when I approached. He was staring toward the deeper sections of the tunnel, the parts we hadn't finished drilling yet. I glanced around the table at the officials. Mills had her hands folded, but I could see the tension in her knuckles. The thin man with glasses was watching Bill intently, his legal pad forgotten. I tried talking to him. Bill continued, his voice growing strained. Called his name, asked what was wrong, tried to get him to focus on me, but Jose just kept mumbling the same things over and over. Bill stopped, closing his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, the haunted look was stronger than ever. He kept saying the voices told him he wasn't alone down there, that something was watching him from the darkness below. He wouldn't look at me directly, just kept his eyes fixed on those deeper tunnel sections, rocking back and forth. I found myself leaning forward despite my attempt to remain professionally detached. The clinical part of my mind was cataloging possible explanations: claustrophobia, oxygen deprivation, psychological breakdown from isolation, and stress. But something in Bill's tone suggested those standard explanations wouldn't be sufficient. Jose wouldn't respond to direct questions, Bill said, his voice barely above a whisper now. I'd ask him what happened, where he was hurt, if he could walk. Nothing. Just that same mumbling about voices and being watched. He kept repeating that something was down there with him, something that shouldn't exist. Mills shifted in her seat, and I caught her exchanging another glance with her colleagues. Whatever they knew about Jose Garcia's current condition, it wasn't good news. Getting him to the surface took over an hour, Bill continued. Had to practically carry him up the ladder. Jose kept looking back down the shaft like he expected something to follow us up. Even at the surface, in broad daylight, he wouldn't stop staring at the tunnel opening. Bill reached for his coffee cup with shaking hands, taking a small sip before continuing. Emergency medical helicopter arrived within 2 hours. Phoenix Psychiatric Facility. Jose was completely unresponsive during the flight. Wouldn't answer questions, wouldn't make eye contact. Just kept mumbling about the voices. I glanced at Mills, noting the uncomfortable expression that crossed her face when Bill mentioned the psychiatric facility. There was something about Garcia's current status that she didn't want to discuss in detail. I reported the incident to my government contacts immediately, Bill said, his voice taking on a bitter edge. Expected them to suspend the project, maybe bring in medical personnel to evaluate the entire crew. Standard procedure after a psychological breakdown in dangerous working conditions. The wire-rimmed man's pen was moving again, scratching across the legal pad as he took notes. But his expression suggested he already knew what Bill was about to say. Instead, they ordered us to continue. Said Garcia's incident was an isolated case, probably related to pre-existing psychological conditions that hadn't been identified during the security screening. They wanted the drilling completed on schedule. Bill's voice cracked slightly, and I watched his professional composure finally beginning to collapse completely. Jose Garcia is still in that psychiatric facility, he said, looking directly at Mills for the first time since starting his account. Still unable to work underground. Still mumbling about voices in the darkness, 3 weeks later, and the doctors say he hasn't improved at all. Mills avoided Bill's look, focusing instead on the papers in front of her. The discomfort around the table was obvious now. Whatever had happened to Garcia was ongoing, not a resolved incident from the past. We should have stopped after Jose, Bill said, his voice barely audible. Should have shut down the entire operation and gotten the hell out of that desert. But the contract pressures, the secrecy requirements, the government officials insisting we continue. He trailed off, staring at his hands. The tremor was worse now, and I could see the exhaustion in his posture, the weight of decisions that had led to consequences he couldn't undo. I found myself gripping my pen tighter, realizing that Garcia's breakdown was just the beginning of Bill's account. Whatever had driven an experienced tunnel worker to complete psychological collapse was still down there in those Arizona shafts, and Bill's crew had been ordered to continue working around it. The room remained silent except for the ventilation system and the steady blinking of the recording device, capturing every word of testimony that was becoming more disturbing with each detail Bill revealed. Bill's shoulders sagged as he stared at his empty coffee cup, the weight of his previous words settling over the room like a physical presence. The officials around the table had grown increasingly tense during his account of Garcia's breakdown, and I could see Mills checking her watch, as if she knew what was coming next would be worse. 2 days after we evacuated Jose, Bill continued, his voice taking on a hollow quality that made my skin crawl. David Klein was working the parallel shaft, Section B, about 500 feet down. Different tunnel, but running roughly parallel to where Jose had his breakdown. The wire-rimmed man opened a new folder, and I caught a glimpse of medical reports, with Klein's name typed across the top. Whatever had happened to David Klein, the government had documented it thoroughly. David was solid, Bill said, his hands now pressed flat against the table again. 34 years old, 8 years of tunnel experience. Never had a safety violation, never panicked under pressure. The kind of guy you could count on to follow protocols even when things went wrong. Mills reached for her own folder, extracting several sheets of paper that looked like incident reports. The way she handled them suggested she'd reviewed Klein's case multiple times, but it still bothered her. About 3 in the afternoon, we heard screaming coming up from the shafts, Bill said, and his voice cracked slightly. Not just yelling, screaming, the kind of sound a man makes when he's genuinely terrified for his life. I found myself gripping my pen tighter, though I'd stopped taking notes. The clinical part of my mind was cataloging details, but something deeper was responding to the raw fear in Bill's voice. The sound was echoing up from Klein's shaft, bouncing off the rock walls and reaching the surface distorted. But even with the acoustic problems, we could tell he was in serious trouble. My surface coordinator tried raising him on the radio immediately. Bill paused, running his hand through his unkempt hair. The tremor in his fingers was getting worse, and I noticed he'd started breathing faster. Klein was screaming about something grabbing him, trying to pull him deeper into the tunnel. He kept yelling that something had him by the leg, that it was dragging him towards sections we hadn't even drilled yet. The thin man with glasses glanced up from his legal pad, and I caught the uncomfortable expression that crossed his face. These weren't just stories to the officials. They were documented incidents with ongoing implications. Emergency protocol kicked in immediately, Bill continued. Full crew response, safety equipment deployed, emergency lighting lowered into the shaft. We could see Klein at the bottom, but something was wrong with his position. Bill stopped, closing his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, the haunted look was stronger than ever. David was pressed against the tunnel wall, clutching his left leg. Blood was seeping through his work pants, and even from the surface we could see he was badly hurt. But the screaming had stopped. He was just whimpering now, staring toward the deeper sections of the tunnel. Mills slid one of the medical reports across the table toward me, but kept her finger on it so I couldn't read the details. I caught glimpses of injury descriptions and treatment notes. I went down myself, Bill said, his voice barely above a whisper. Fastest descent I'd ever made, down 500 feet in maybe 10 minutes. Found David exactly where the emergency lights had shown him, blood pooling around his leg. The recording device continued its steady blinking, capturing every word of testimony that was becoming more disturbing with each detail. His left leg was torn up badly, deep gashes running from his calf to his ankle, like something with claws had grabbed him and tried to drag him across the rough rock. The cuts were too precise to be accidental, too deep and too evenly spaced. I studied Bill's face as he spoke. The professional contractor was completely gone now, replaced by someone who'd witnessed trauma that defied rational explanation. David kept insisting that hands had grabbed him, Bill continued, his voice growing strained. Not claws, not equipment malfunction, hands. He said something down there had gripped his leg and tried to pull him toward the tunnel sections we hadn't finished drilling. He could feel fingers pressing into his flesh. Mills shifted uncomfortably in her seat, and I noticed she was avoiding eye contact with Bill during this part of his account. The security cameras showed nothing, Bill said, and the bitterness in his voice was unmistakable. We had monitoring equipment throughout the tunnel system, full video coverage of every work area. The footage showed David working normally, then suddenly screaming and falling against the wall. No other personnel in his section, no equipment malfunction, nothing that would explain his injuries. I found myself leaning forward despite my attempt to remain professionally detached. The disconnect between Klein's physical injuries and the lack of any visible cause was deeply unsettling. David was conscious during the evacuation, but he wouldn't look toward the deeper sections of the tunnel, Bill said. Even while we were treating his wounds, even while he was in serious pain, he kept his eyes fixed on the surface, like he was afraid something would follow him up. The wire-rimmed man had stopped taking notes entirely, his pen resting motionless on the legal pad. Even the soft scratching sound had ceased, leaving only the ventilation system humming in the background. Emergency medical helicopter arrived within an hour, Bill continued. David was airlifted to Phoenix General for surgery on his leg. The doctors said the gashes were consistent with some kind of animal attack, but there were no indigenous species in that area capable of causing those injuries. Mills glanced at her colleagues, and I caught the subtle tension in their exchange. Whatever Klein's current status was, it remained a source of concern for the government officials. I reported the incident immediately, Bill said, his voice taking on that same bitter edge I'd heard when he described the response to Garcia's breakdown. Expected immediate project suspension, safety investigation, probably criminal investigation given the severity of David's injuries. But even as he said it, I could see in his expression that he'd been disappointed again. Instead, they ordered enhanced security measures and continued drilling. Said Klein's injuries were probably self-inflicted due to psychological stress, maybe some kind of breakdown similar to Garcia's case. They wanted the project completed despite 2 serious incidents in 4 days. Bill's voice was barely audible now, and I had to lean forward to hear him clearly. David Klein still walks with a limp, he said, looking directly at Mills. Still has nightmares about hands grabbing him in the darkness. 3 weeks later, and he refuses to work underground anymore. Says he can still feel fingers pressing into his leg. The silence in the room was complete, except for the steady blinking of the recording device. I watched Bill gather himself for what I suspected would be the worst part of his account. Carlos Ramirez, Bill said, and his voice broke slightly on the name. 41 years old, 20 years of tunnel experience. Most careful worker I'd ever supervised. Never took risks, never cut corners on safety protocols. Mills reached for another folder, this one thicker than the others. The way she handled it suggested Carlos Ramirez's case was different from Garcia and Klein, more complex, more disturbing. Carlos was performing routine equipment checks the day after Klein's evacuation, Bill continued. Standard maintenance on the communication systems and emergency lighting. One-man job, no danger involved, just checking connections and replacing batteries. Bill paused, staring at the conference table. His hands had moved from pressing against the surface to gripping the edge, knuckles white with tension. About noon, Carlos started talking on his radio about seeing light coming from the deeper sections of the tunnel. Bright white light, he said. Like floodlights had been installed in areas we hadn't even reached yet. I glanced around the table at the officials. The uncomfortable expressions were more pronounced now, and I noticed the thin man with glasses had started writing again, his pen moving rapidly across the legal pad. My surface coordinator tried to verify the light source, Bill said, his voice growing strained. We had monitoring equipment throughout the tunnel system, emergency lighting controls, full electrical oversight. Nothing was generating light in those deeper sections. Nothing was even connected down there. Bill's breathing had become more labored, and I could see sweat forming on his forehead despite the conference room's cool temperature. Carlos kept describing the light getting brighter, more intense. He said it was beautiful, like nothing he'd ever seen underground. He started moving toward it instead of continuing his equipment checks. The wire-rimmed man's pen had stopped moving, and I caught him exchanging a worried glance with Mills. Whatever Ramirez had experienced, it had affected him differently than Garcia and Klein. That's when Carlos removed his safety helmet, Bill said, and his voice cracked completely. 20 years of tunnel experience, and he took off his hard hat while working 500 feet underground. Then he unclipped his safety harness. Mills closed her eyes for a moment, as if she'd heard this part before, but it still affected her. The surface coordinator was yelling into the radio, ordering Carlos to stop, to put his safety equipment back on, to return to the designated work area. But Carlos wasn't responding to commands anymore. Bill's hands were shaking violently now, and I watched him struggle to maintain enough composure to finish his account. Carlos started walking toward the deeper sections of the tunnel, following the light that nobody else could see. He was talking on his radio, describing how beautiful it was, how it was calling to him. His voice sounded different, happy, almost peaceful. The silence in the room had become oppressive, broken only by the ventilation system and Bill's increasingly labored breathing. Then he started screaming, Bill said, his voice barely a whisper. Not like David's screams when something grabbed him. These were different. Terrified, desperate, like he'd suddenly realized he was in terrible danger. Bill stopped, covering his face with both hands. The professional contractor was completely gone now, replaced by someone broken by experiences that had shattered his understanding of reality. The screams lasted maybe 10 seconds. He continued, his words muffled by his hands. Then complete silence. Radio contact cut off. No response to any attempts at communication. Mills reached for her folder again, extracting what looked like search reports and equipment logs. The documentation was extensive, suggesting Ramirez's disappearance had triggered a major investigation. Emergency response team went down immediately, Bill said, lowering his hands and revealing tears streaming down his weathered face. Full search of the tunnel system. Emergency lighting deployed throughout every section we'd completed. I found myself holding my breath, waiting for what I suspected would be the most disturbing part of Bill's entire account. They found Carlos's helmet about 50 feet from where he'd been working, Bill said, his voice breaking completely. His safety harness was clipped to a support beam another 20 feet deeper, but no body, no trace of Carlos himself. The recording device continued its steady blinking, capturing testimony that challenged every rational explanation I could think of. The tunnel showed no signs of collapse, no alternative exits, no way for a person to simply disappear. Bill continued through his tears. Solid rock walls, secure floor, ceiling intact. Carlos Ramirez had vanished without a trace in a confined space with only one exit. Mills and her colleagues were avoiding eye contact with Bill now, their discomfort obvious. Whatever had happened to Ramirez remained unexplained 3 weeks later. Search teams spent 18 hours going through every inch of the tunnel system, Bill said. Brought in dogs, thermal imaging, ground-penetrating radar. Nothing. Carlos was just gone. Bill wiped his face with his sleeve, trying to regain some composure, but the tears continued flowing. Within 6 hours of Carlos's disappearance, government officials arrived at the site, he said, his voice taking on a bitter edge. Not rescue teams, not investigators, men in suits with classified authority. They shut down the entire operation immediately. The wire-rimmed man was writing rapidly again, documenting details that I suspected were already well known to everyone except me. All equipment was confiscated, Bill continued. Every piece of machinery, every tool, every scrap of documentation. My crew was debriefed individually and required to sign additional secrecy agreements. Nobody was allowed to return to the site. Bill looked around the table at each of the officials, his expression a mixture of grief and anger. 3 good men, he said, his voice barely audible. Jose Garcia in a psychiatric facility. David Klein permanently injured. Carlos Ramirez missing and presumed dead. All because we kept drilling when we should have stopped after the first incident. Mills finally met Bill's eyes, and I could see genuine remorse in her expression. Whatever pressures had driven the decision to continue the project, she clearly regretted the consequences. I left the contracting business the day after the shutdown, Bill said, his professional composure completely shattered. 30 years of underground work, and I can't even look at a tunnel entrance anymore without remembering those voices, those screams, the way Carlos sounded so happy right before. He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. The silence in the room was complete except for his quiet sobbing and the steady hum of the ventilation system. I sat motionless, my pen forgotten, trying to process an account that challenged everything I understood about underground construction hazards. 3 experienced workers had been affected by phenomena that defied rational explanation, and I was being asked to provide scientific analysis of events that seemed to exist outside the boundaries of known science. Bill wiped his eyes again and looked directly at me, his expression hollow but determined. "That's what happened in Arizona, Dr. Thompson," he said, his voice stronger now that he'd completed his account. "That's why they shut down the project and brought you here. Because 3 weeks later, nobody can explain what we encountered down there." The recording device continued blinking, capturing the end of testimony that would haunt me for the rest of my career. Whatever was buried in that Arizona desert had broken a veteran contractor and claimed 3 members of his crew, and I was being asked to find a scientific explanation for the unexplainable. I set my pen down and studied Bill's tear-streaked face across the conference table. The recording device continued its steady blinking, capturing the silence that followed his account of Carlos Ramirez's disappearance. Mills and her colleagues exchanged glances, while Bill wiped his eyes with his sleeve, trying to compose himself after reliving 3 weeks of trauma. My mind was already cataloging the details he'd provided, sorting them into categories that might yield scientific explanations. Garcia's psychological breakdown could be attributed to claustrophobia or oxygen deprivation. Klein's injuries might have resulted from equipment malfunction or self-inflicted wounds during a panic attack. But Ramirez's complete disappearance from a confined space defied rational analysis. "Mr. Anderson," I said, opening my notebook to a fresh page, "I need to ask you some specific technical questions about the environmental conditions you encountered." Bill nodded, straightening in his chair. The professional contractor was trying to reassert itself over the traumatized witness. "Let's start with atmospheric readings," I continued. "Did your crew monitor oxygen levels, carbon dioxide concentrations, or other gases that might accumulate in deep vertical shafts?" "Standard protocol," Bill replied, his voice hoarse but steadier. "Continuous monitoring at all depths. Oxygen stayed within normal ranges throughout the project. No toxic gas buildup, no methane emissions, nothing that would explain hallucinations or psychological effects." I made notes while he spoke, checking details against my own experience with underground construction. Deep boring operations typically encountered predictable atmospheric challenges, but Bill's account suggested normal readings throughout. "What about temperature variations?" I asked. "Significant changes in ambient temperature can affect worker psychology and equipment function." "Brutal heat at the surface," Bill said, running his hand through his unkempt hair. 110 degrees daily, but the deeper sections stayed cool, maybe 65 degrees at maximum depth. Nothing unusual for desert underground work. Mills opened one of her folders and slid a sheet across the table toward me. Environmental monitoring data printed in neat columns with timestamps and measurements. I scanned the numbers quickly, finding everything within expected parameters. "Tell me about the acoustic properties you mentioned," I said, looking up from the data. "The strange way voices carried in the tunnels. Can you be more specific about what you heard?" Bill's hands started trembling again, but he maintained eye contact. Conversations seemed to echo from sections we hadn't drilled yet. Not just normal echoes bouncing off rock walls. These sounded like they were coming from below, from deeper parts of the tunnel system that didn't exist. I wrote down his description, though it challenged basic principles of sound transmission. Acoustic anomalies could result from unusual rock formations or air pressure differentials, but Bill's account suggested something more complex. Did the acoustic problems affect all crew members equally? I asked. Or did some workers report the phenomena more frequently than others? Everyone heard it, Bill said without hesitation. Different shifts, different workers, same reports. Voices and whispers coming from undrilled sections. It wasn't isolated to specific individuals or psychological profiles. The universality of the reports was troubling. Mass hallucinations were possible under extreme stress conditions, but Bill's crew consisted of experienced professionals accustomed to underground work. Their unanimous accounts suggested an external cause rather than collective psychological breakdown. I need to see the documentation, I said, addressing Mills directly. Geological surveys, equipment logs, medical reports from the 3 incidents, environmental monitoring data, radio transcripts, any video footage from the tunnel cameras. Mills exchanged glances with her colleagues, and I caught the hesitation in their expressions. These weren't standard government documents. They contained classified information about phenomena that had prompted the highest levels of secrecy. Dr. Thompson, Mills said carefully, the materials you're requesting are extremely sensitive. Access requires additional clearance levels beyond what we've discussed. I can't provide scientific analysis without examining the evidence, I replied, keeping my tone professional but firm. If you want me to understand what happened at that site, I need complete documentation of environmental conditions, equipment performance, and the medical status of the affected crew members. The wire-rimmed man was taking notes again, his pen moving rapidly across the legal pad. Mills consulted a thick folder, reviewing what appeared to be security protocols and authorization procedures. The scientific importance of this investigation justifies expanded access, I continued, watching their faces for signs of agreement. Whatever happened in Arizona challenges conventional understanding of underground hazards. Proper analysis requires comprehensive data review. Mills closed her folder and nodded slowly. We can approve document access under enhanced security protocols. You'll review the materials here under supervision, with no copies or external communication permitted. I spent the next 2 hours examining files that painted a detailed picture of the Arizona operation. Geological surveys showed standard desert rock formations with no unusual mineral deposits or structural anomalies. Equipment logs documented perfect mechanical function throughout the project. No equipment failures, no maintenance issues, no technical problems that might explain the incidents. The medical reports were more disturbing. Garcia's psychiatric evaluation described complete withdrawal from reality, persistent auditory hallucinations, and an inability to function in enclosed spaces. Klein's injury documentation included photographs of his torn leg, deep, precise gashes that looked exactly like claw marks from some large predator. Ramirez's missing person report contained extensive search records and forensic analysis of his abandoned safety equipment. Video footage from the tunnel cameras showed normal work activities right up until each incident occurred. Garcia appeared fine during routine inspection work, then suddenly curled up in the corner without any visible trigger. Klein was conducting standard equipment checks when he began screaming and clutching his leg, though the cameras showed no source for his injuries. Ramirez's footage was the most unsettling. He removed his safety gear and walked calmly toward deeper tunnel sections while describing beautiful light that wasn't visible on camera. Radio transcripts captured the workers' voices during each incident, Garcia's mumbling about voices from below, Klein's desperate screams about something grabbing his leg, Ramirez's peaceful description of approaching light, followed by terrified screams before communication cut off completely. By late afternoon, I had documented every detail I could extract from the classified materials. The evidence painted a clear picture of 3 experienced workers affected by phenomena that defied conventional explanation. No equipment malfunctions, no environmental hazards, no pre-existing psychological conditions that might account for their experiences. I need to visit the site I announced, closing the last folder and looking around the table at the officials. Conduct atmospheric analysis. Examine the geological formations. Take measurements of the acoustic properties Bill described. Mills shook her head immediately. The site is under complete security lockdown. No civilian access permitted under any circumstances. I'm not a civilian, I replied, keeping my voice steady. I'm a consultant with specialized expertise in underground phenomena. You brought me here to provide scientific analysis of what happened. I can't do that from a conference room in Arlington. The thin man with glasses looked up from his legal pad, and I caught him glancing at Mills with an expression that suggested they'd discussed this possibility. Dr. Thompson, Mills said carefully, site access would require military escort, enhanced security protocols, and strict limitations on your investigation parameters. I accept those conditions, I said without hesitation. I need 12 hours on site to conduct proper atmospheric and geological analysis, environmental monitoring equipment, rock sampling tools, acoustic measurement devices. Bill had been silent during my document review, but now he looked up with an expression of genuine concern. You don't understand what you're asking for, he said quietly. That place, there's something wrong with it. Something that broke 3 good men. I met his eyes, seeing the fear and trauma that still haunted him 3 weeks later. But my scientific training demanded direct observation and measurement of the phenomena he'd described. Mr. Anderson, I said, I appreciate your concern, but I need to examine the site personally to provide accurate analysis of what happened to your crew. Mills consulted her folder again, then nodded reluctantly. We can arrange site access tomorrow morning. Military helicopter to Phoenix, then ground transport with federal escort to the location. Strict security protocols, limited investigation time, no deviation from approved procedures. I boarded the flight to Phoenix the following morning with a carry-on bag containing specialized monitoring equipment and sampling tools. The 2 federal agents assigned as my escort sat across the aisle, reviewing security protocols and site access procedures during the 3-hour flight. The drive from Phoenix took nearly 2 hours through increasingly desolate desert terrain. We left the main highway after 40 minutes, following unmarked dirt roads that cut through scrubland and rocky hills. No other vehicles, no signs of human habitation, just endless expanses of sand and scattered vegetation under the brutal Arizona sun. The facility appeared suddenly beyond a low ridge, several temporary structures arranged around 3 circular openings in the desert floor, prefabricated buildings for equipment storage, crew quarters, and command operations. Everything looked abandoned but well maintained, as if the workers had simply walked away and never returned. I climbed out of the air-conditioned vehicle and immediately felt the desert heat hit me like a physical blow. 110 degrees, just as Bill had described. The agents put on sunglasses and baseball caps, then led me toward the tunnel openings. Each vertical shaft was sealed with a heavy steel plate bolted directly into the surrounding rock. The metal was spotless, showing no signs of corrosion or weathering despite 3 weeks of desert exposure. Government efficiency at its finest. Whatever was down there had been locked away thoroughly. What struck me most was the complete silence. No insects buzzing, no birds calling, no small animals rustling through the sparse vegetation. I'd worked in remote desert locations before, and there was always some wildlife activity. Here, nothing moved except the heat waves rising from the sun-baked ground. "Have you noticed the absence of animals?" I asked the senior agent, a tall man with military bearing who'd introduced himself only as Agent Martinez. "Local seismic monitoring hasn't detected any unusual underground activity since project termination," he replied, avoiding my question about wildlife. "Ground sensors show normal stability, no structural movement or geological changes." I walked around the sealed tunnel openings, examining the surface equipment that remained in place. Generators, ventilation systems, communication arrays, everything appeared to be in perfect working condition. No rust, no mechanical wear, no signs of the harsh desert environment taking its toll. Has any of this equipment been tested since the shutdown? I asked, crouching next to a ventilation unit that looked like it could start up immediately. Maintenance crews conducted full system checks 2 weeks ago, Agent Martinez said. Everything functions normally. No mechanical failures that might explain the incidents. I spent an hour examining the surface installations, taking photographs, and making notes about equipment placement and condition. The organization was impressive. Bill's crew had established a professional operation with proper safety protocols and backup systems, but the more I studied the site, the more unsettled I became. The silence was oppressive, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. The federal agents stayed close to the vehicle, checking their watches frequently and scanning the horizon like they expected something to appear. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains when I finally approached the sealed tunnel openings. Each steel plate was marked with warning signs and security classifications, but I could see gaps around the edges where air might still circulate between the surface and the depths below. "I need to go down there," I said, looking at Agent Martinez. "Conduct atmospheric analysis, examine the tunnel walls, take rock samples from the sections where the incidents occurred." His expression suggested this was exactly what he'd been dreading since we arrived. "Dr. Thompson, site access protocols are extremely strict. Any deviation from approved procedures requires authorization from Washington." "You brought me here to investigate," I replied, keeping my tone professional despite my growing frustration. "I can't provide scientific analysis without examining the tunnels directly." Agent Martinez spoke quietly into his radio, confirming security protocols and requesting permission for tunnel access. The conversation lasted several minutes, with multiple confirmations and authorization codes. While he coordinated with his superiors, I studied the sealed openings and tried to imagine what Bill's crew had encountered in the darkness below. 3 experienced workers, each affected by phenomena that challenged rational explanation. Garcia's breakdown, Klein's mysterious injuries, Ramirez's disappearance from a confined space. The federal agents were obviously reluctant to allow my investigation to continue, but they'd brought me across the country specifically to examine this site. Whatever was down there in those Arizona tunnels, the government needed scientific analysis to understand it. As the afternoon progressed and the desert heat began its slow retreat toward evening, I prepared my equipment for descent into the depths where 3 men had faced something that defied human comprehension. I checked the seal on my breathing apparatus one final time while Agent Martinez unbolted the heavy steel plate covering the first tunnel opening. The metal groaned as he pulled it aside, revealing a circular shaft that dropped straight down into absolute darkness. The contrast between the blazing desert heat and the cool air drifting up from below was immediate and welcome. "Radio check every 15 minutes, Agent Martinez said, handing me a standard 2-way radio. "Any problems, you stop what you're doing and head back up immediately." I clipped the radio to my belt and adjusted the straps on my equipment pack. The atmospheric monitoring device felt reassuringly heavy against my back, along with rock sampling tools, a digital camera, and backup lighting systems. Everything I needed to conduct a proper scientific investigation of the tunnel where Jose Garcia had experienced his psychological breakdown. The metal ladder rungs were exactly as Bill had described, installed every few feet down the shaft, solid and secure despite 3 weeks of abandonment. I tested the first few rungs with my full weight, checking for any structural issues that might explain the incidents. The steel held perfectly, showing no signs of corrosion or weakness. My descent began slowly and methodically. Every 50 feet I stopped to record atmospheric readings and examine the tunnel walls with my flashlight. The rock showed precise drilling work, clean cuts that spoke to the quality equipment Bill's crew had used. No structural damage, no unusual mineral deposits, nothing that would indicate geological instability. At 100 feet, I noticed the temperature beginning to drop. My digital thermometer showed a steady decrease from the surface heat, which made sense given the thermal properties of solid rock. Desert environments typically maintained cooler temperatures at depth, and this tunnel was following predictable patterns. The shaft continued straight down with no deviation or branching passages. I could see the bottom now, maybe 400 feet below, where portable work lights created a dim circle of illumination. Bill's crew had left their temporary installation intact when the project was shut down: metal brackets for equipment, communication cables, and basic lighting systems. At 200 feet, I conducted another comprehensive atmospheric check. Oxygen levels remained normal, carbon dioxide well within acceptable ranges, no detection of methane or other gases that might cause hallucinations or cognitive impairment. Whatever had affected Garcia, it wasn't atmospheric in nature. My radio crackled with Agent Martinez's voice checking my status. "All normal," I replied, my words echoing strangely in the confined space. The sound seemed to bounce off the rock walls in ways I hadn't expected, creating almost a doubling effect, as if my voice was traveling both up and down the shaft simultaneously. At 300 feet, the temperature drop became more pronounced. My equipment registered a decrease of nearly 40 degrees from the surface, bringing the tunnel temperature down to a comfortable 68 degrees. The change was significant enough to affect worker comfort, but well within normal ranges for deep underground construction. I paused to examine the rock face more closely with my flashlight. The drilling pattern was uniform and professional, exactly what I'd expect from experienced operators using quality equipment. No stress fractures, no signs of water seepage, no geological anomalies that might create unusual acoustic properties. But the sound issue was becoming more noticeable. Every small noise I made, adjusting my equipment, scraping my boots against the ladder rungs, clearing my throat, seemed to echo in ways that defied the tunnel's simple geometry. The acoustic behavior suggested a more complex space than the straightforward vertical shaft I was descending. At 400 feet, I stopped for another radio check and atmospheric reading, still normal across all parameters. The tunnel walls showed the same precise drilling work, the same solid rock composition. If I hadn't known about the incidents that occurred here, I would have classified this as a textbook example of safe underground construction. The bottom of the shaft was only 200 feet below now, and I could make out more details of the work area Bill's crew had established. They'd done professional work, proper equipment placement, organized tool storage, communication systems installed according to standard safety protocols. Nothing suggested the chaotic circumstances that had led to Garcia's breakdown. I continued my descent, documenting every detail that might provide insight into what had happened here. The ladder rungs remained solid and secure. The rock walls showed no unusual features, and my environmental monitoring equipment recorded no hazardous conditions. At 500 feet, the acoustic properties became even more pronounced. My breathing seemed to echo from directions that didn't match the tunnel's layout. Sounds appeared to originate from below, even when logic suggested they should reflect off the walls around me. It was subtle but persistent, the kind of phenomenon that might unsettle workers who spent hours in this environment. The bottom of the shaft opened into a cramped work area roughly 12 feet in diameter. Portable floodlights mounted on metal stands provided adequate illumination, though they'd been switched off since the project's termination. Bill's crew had organized the space efficiently: tool storage along one wall, communication equipment mounted on brackets, emergency supplies secured in metal containers. I activated my camera and began documenting everything I could see. The space showed no signs of struggle or unusual disturbance. Garcia's breakdown had apparently occurred during routine inspection work, with no physical evidence of what had triggered his psychological collapse. My atmospheric monitoring equipment continued recording normal readings throughout the work area. Oxygen levels remained stable. Temperature held steady at 66 degrees. No toxic gases or unusual chemical emissions that might explain hallucinations or mental confusion. I began collecting rock samples from different sections of the tunnel walls, using standard geological tools to extract small cores for later analysis. The rock composition appeared consistent with the desert formations documented in the pre-construction surveys, primarily sedimentary layers with some igneous intrusions. Nothing unusual or unexpected based on the regional geology. but the acoustic anomaly persisted throughout my investigation. Every sound I made seemed to carry in strange ways, as if the tunnel possessed acoustic properties that shouldn't exist in such a simple vertical shaft. My voice echoed with an unusual doubling effect, and small noises appeared to originate from directions that didn't match their actual source. I photographed the tool storage area where Garcia had been found curled up and rocking. The space looked completely normal. Metal shelving units, organized equipment, proper safety procedures followed throughout. No evidence of what had triggered his complete psychological breakdown or his persistent mumbling about voices from below. The communication equipment showed no signs of malfunction or unusual behavior. I tested the emergency radio system briefly, confirming clear contact with the surface agents. The technology was working perfectly, just as Bill had described throughout the project's duration. After collecting samples from multiple locations around the work area, I began a systematic examination of the tunnel walls at the bottom of the shaft. My flashlight revealed the same precise drilling work I'd observed during my descent, with clean cuts and solid rock composition. No structural weaknesses, no geological anomalies, nothing that would explain the strange reports from Bill's crew. I spent nearly an hour documenting every detail I could observe, photographing the work area from multiple angles, and recording comprehensive atmospheric data. My radio maintained clear contact with the surface, and all environmental readings remained within normal parameters throughout the investigation. The acoustic properties remained the most unusual aspect of the tunnel. Sounds continued carrying in ways that defied the space's simple geometry, creating an almost disorienting effect as my voice seemed to echo from multiple directions simultaneously. It was subtle enough that workers might initially dismiss it, but persistent enough to become unsettling over extended periods. I packed my equipment carefully, securing the rock samples and confirming that my camera had captured all necessary documentation. The investigation had revealed no obvious hazards or unusual conditions that might explain the psychological breakdown Jose Garcia had experienced in this location. Agent Martinez's voice crackled through my radio, requesting a status update. "Investigation complete," I replied, beginning my preparation for the ascent back to the surface. "No immediate hazards detected, all systems normal." I started climbing the metal ladder rungs, carrying my equipment pack and rock samples toward the desert heat above. The tunnel's acoustic properties continued affecting every sound I made during the ascent, creating that strange doubling effect that seemed to originate from depths below the work area. My atmospheric monitoring equipment recorded gradual temperature increases as I climbed toward the surface, confirming the expected thermal gradient for this type of geological formation. Everything appeared normal and predictable based on standard underground construction parameters, but something about the acoustic anomaly nagged at my scientific understanding. The way sounds carried suggested a more complex space than the simple vertical shaft I'd investigated. It was the kind of detail that might merit further investigation under different circumstances. I reached the 300-foot mark, halfway to the surface, when Agent Martinez checked my progress again. "Proceeding normally," I reported, though the strange echo effect made my voice sound unsettling even to me. Environmental readings all within acceptable ranges. The temperature continued rising as I climbed higher, approaching the brutal desert heat that waited at the surface. My equipment pack felt heavier with each ladder rung, weighed down by rock samples and documentation that might provide insight into what had happened to Bill's crew. At 200 feet from the surface, I paused for a final atmospheric reading and equipment check. Normal oxygen levels, stable temperature gradient, no toxic gases or unusual chemical emissions. The tunnel appeared completely safe from a scientific perspective, showing no obvious hazards that might explain the psychological trauma experienced by Garcia, Klein, and Ramirez. The acoustic properties remained unexplained, but didn't constitute a safety hazard under any standard I could reference. Strange sound behavior was documented in other underground construction projects, usually attributed to unusual rock formations or air pressure differentials, Nothing that would justify shutting down an operation or cause lasting psychological damage to experienced workers. I resumed my climb toward the surface, my mind already organizing the data I'd collected into a preliminary report. The investigation had been thorough and professional, documenting atmospheric conditions, geological features, and equipment status throughout the tunnel system. Everything indicated normal construction parameters with no obvious explanation for the incidents that had occurred. The ladder rungs remained solid and secure throughout my ascent, confirming the quality workmanship Bill's crew had demonstrated in their installation procedures. The tunnel itself showed professional-grade drilling work with no structural issues or geological anomalies that might create hazardous conditions. At 100 feet from the surface, I could see Agent Martinez's silhouette against the brilliant desert sky, waiting for my emergence from the darkness below. The temperature was rising noticeably now, approaching the 110-degree heat that dominated the Arizona landscape above ground. I climbed the final ladder rungs toward the surface, carrying documentation and samples that would form the basis of my scientific analysis. The investigation had revealed no immediate explanations for the psychological trauma experienced by Bill's crew, though the acoustic anomalies might warrant further study under controlled conditions. Agent Martinez helped me clear the tunnel opening, and I emerged into the blazing desert heat, with my equipment pack intact and my initial investigation complete. I had no way of knowing that my real encounter with the phenomena that had destroyed 3 experienced workers was still waiting in the depths below. I was 50 feet from the surface when the whispers started. They drifted up from below like a conversation carried on wind, soft enough that I almost dismissed them as equipment noise or my own breathing echoing strangely off the tunnel walls. But I'd been listening to those acoustic anomalies for over an hour, and this was different. These sounds had rhythm, cadence, the unmistakable pattern of human speech. I stopped climbing and pressed myself against the ladder, straining to identify what I was hearing. The whispers seemed to originate from the work area I'd just left, maybe deeper. My equipment pack shifted against my back as I turned to look down the shaft, trying to pinpoint the source. Agent Martinez's voice crackled through my radio. "Dr. Thompson, status report." "Hold on," I replied, switching off the radio before he could respond. I needed to hear this clearly, without interference. The whispers continued, definitely coming from below. Not the strange echoing effect I'd documented throughout my investigation, but actual voices speaking in what sounded like conversation. Multiple speakers, though I couldn't make out individual words or even determine what language they were using. My scientific training kicked in immediately. Possible explanations ran through my mind. Air currents creating sound through rock formations, equipment malfunction producing audio feedback, even radio transmissions bleeding through on frequencies I couldn't detect. All of these had documented precedents in underground construction environments. But my atmospheric monitoring equipment hadn't detected any air movement significant enough to create vocal sounds. The communication systems had tested perfectly during my investigation, and these whispers had the organic quality of actual human speech, not mechanical interference. I descended 20 feet, moving slowly and listening carefully. The whispers grew slightly clearer, though I still couldn't understand what was being said. The sounds seemed to originate from the work area at the bottom of the shaft, but I'd spent an hour examining every inch of that space. There was nowhere for people to hide, no openings or passages beyond the single vertical tunnel. At 100 feet from the surface, I stopped again and activated my radio. "Agent Martinez, are there any personnel in adjacent tunnels or connecting passages?" "Negative," came the immediate reply. "All tunnel systems are sealed. You're the only person below ground." I switched the radio off again and continued my descent. The whispers were becoming more distinct, though not more intelligible. Multiple voices speaking in overlapping patterns, like people having separate conversations in the same space. The sound quality suggested they were close, maybe in the work area itself. Back at the bottom of the shaft, I activated my flashlight and swept it around the cramped space. Everything looked exactly as I'd left it, Organized tool storage, communication equipment, emergency supplies. No signs of human presence beyond my own recent disturbance of the area. But the whispers were definitely coming from here. I could hear them clearly now, though they seemed to originate from every direction at once. The acoustic properties I'd documented earlier were amplifying the effect, making it impossible to identify a specific source location. I examined the tunnel walls more carefully, looking for openings or fissures I might have missed during my initial investigation. The rock showed the same precise drilling work, the same solid composition. No cracks large enough to transmit sound from adjacent spaces, no evidence of connecting passages or chambers. My atmospheric monitoring equipment still showed normal readings throughout the work area. No air movement, no pressure differentials that might indicate hidden openings. Whatever was creating these whispers wasn't affecting measurable environmental conditions. I moved around the perimeter of the work area, following the sound with my flashlight trained on the tunnel walls. The whispers seemed to shift location as I moved, always staying just ahead of my investigation. It was like trying to track a conversation through a maze of reflecting surfaces. On the eastern wall, behind the communication equipment bracket, I noticed something I'd missed during my earlier examination. A section of rock that looked slightly different from the surrounding surface, smoother with drilling marks that followed a different pattern than the main tunnel construction. I moved the communication equipment aside and examined the area more closely. What I'd initially taken for standard construction work was actually a carefully concealed opening in the tunnel wall. The edges had been smoothed and the surface matched to blend with the surrounding rock, but it was definitely an artificial passage. The opening was narrow, maybe 18 inches wide and barely 2 feet high, just large enough for a person to crawl through, but hidden so well that it wouldn't be visible during normal work activities. Bill's crew could have worked in this area for weeks without noticing the concealed passage. The whispers were coming from beyond this opening. I knelt beside the hidden entrance and directed my flashlight into the space beyond. The beam revealed a horizontal tunnel extending into the rock, carved with the same precision as the main shaft, but clearly not part of the original construction blueprints I'd reviewed. The whispers grew more distinct as I approached the opening. Multiple voices speaking in rapid, overlapping patterns. Still unintelligible, but with an urgency that hadn't been present when I first heard them from above. My mind raced through possible explanations. An undocumented natural cave system that connected to the construction site. A hidden passage carved by previous occupants of the area. Even the possibility that Bill's crew had discovered this opening during their work and failed to report it in their documentation. But none of these explanations accounted for the voices I was hearing. Human speech coming from a passage that extended into solid rock, in a location that should have been completely isolated from any human presence. I activated my radio to report the discovery to Agent Martinez, then realized my hands were shaking too badly to operate the controls properly. Something about those whispers was affecting me in ways that had nothing to do with scientific curiosity or professional investigation. The voices seemed to respond to my presence near the opening. They became more urgent, more insistent, as if calling for my attention. The overlapping conversations separated into individual speakers, though I still couldn't understand what they were saying. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me, unlike anything I'd experienced in 20 years of underground research. This wasn't the normal apprehension of working in confined spaces or the rational concern about unknown hazards. This was primal terror, the kind of fear that existed below conscious thought. My scientific instruments continued reading normal atmospheric conditions throughout the work area. No toxic gases, no pressure changes, no measurable phenomena that might explain my psychological reaction. Every piece of equipment I carried insisted that this was a safe, normal underground environment, but every instinct I possessed screamed at me to leave immediately. The whispers were growing louder now, more distinct. I could hear individual words occasionally, though they were in a language I didn't recognize. The rhythm and intonation suggested human speech, but with qualities that didn't match any linguistic patterns I'd encountered. I found myself leaning toward the opening, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't explain or resist. Part of my mind wanted to crawl into that passage and follow the voices to their source. The scientific part that demanded investigation and evidence, that needed to understand what I was experiencing. But a deeper part, something more fundamental than curiosity, was pulling me back from the concealed entrance. The same survival instinct that had kept humans alive for thousands of years, warning them away from things that meant death, and worse than death. I understood now why Jose Garcia had curled up in the corner of this work area, rocking and mumbling about voices from below. Why David Klein had screamed about hands grabbing him and dragging him toward unfinished tunnel sections. Why Carlos Ramirez had walked calmly toward beautiful light before disappearing completely. Something was calling to workers from this hidden passage. Something that spoke in whispers and promised things that human minds weren't equipped to understand or resist. The voices were responding to my presence, becoming more insistent with each moment I remained near the opening. They weren't random sounds or atmospheric phenomena. They were directed at me specifically, trying to draw me into that concealed tunnel. My equipment pack suddenly felt impossibly heavy, as if the rock samples and monitoring devices were anchoring me to this spot. The whispers seemed to wrap around me, coming from every direction at once, making it difficult to remember which way led back to the main shaft. I forced myself to step away from the opening, fighting against the compulsion that wanted me to crawl into that passage and follow the voices deeper into the rock. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely maintain my grip on the flashlight. The whispers became more urgent as I backed away, almost pleading in their intensity. Words in that unrecognizable language, spoken with emotional weight that transcended meaning. They wanted me to come closer, to enter that hidden tunnel and join whatever waited in the darkness beyond. I grabbed the ladder rungs and started climbing as fast as my trembling hands would allow. The whispers followed me up the shaft, echoing off the tunnel walls in ways that defied every acoustic principle I understood. They seemed to be right behind me, just below the reach of my flashlight beam. At 200 feet, the voices were still audible. At 300 feet, they hadn't diminished at all. The whispers traveled up the main shaft as if the speakers were climbing behind me, maintaining the same distance and intensity throughout my desperate ascent. My radio crackled with Agent Martinez's voice demanding status updates, but I couldn't spare the concentration to respond. All my focus was on climbing faster, getting to the surface, escaping from those voices that promised things no human should hear. At 400 feet, I could see Agent Martinez silhouetted against the desert sky, and the whispers were still following me. They showed no signs of fading with distance, no acoustic behavior that matched the tunnel's physical properties. The voices maintained their urgency and proximity as if they were climbing beside me. I reached the surface, gasping and covered in sweat that had nothing to do with the desert heat. Agent Martinez grabbed my equipment pack as I hauled myself out of the tunnel opening, his expression shifting from professional concern to alarm as he saw my face. The whispers stopped the moment I emerged into daylight. Agent Martinez helped me steady myself against the metal frame covering the tunnel opening. My legs felt unreliable, like they might give out without warning. The equipment pack landed heavily beside my feet, rock samples and monitoring devices that suddenly seemed pointless after what I'd just experienced. "Dr. Thompson, what happened down there?" Martinez asked, his voice carrying professional concern mixed with genuine worry. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I tried to find words that would explain the hidden passage, the whispers, the overwhelming compulsion to crawl into that concealed tunnel and follow voices that shouldn't exist. My mouth opened and closed without producing any sound that made sense. The other agent, Rodriguez, was already securing the steel plate back over the tunnel opening. The heavy metal slammed into place with a finality that should have been reassuring. Instead, I found myself listening for any sound that might carry through the barrier. Whispers that had followed me 400 feet up a vertical shaft as if distance meant nothing. Equipment malfunction, I finally managed, the words feeling like lies even as I spoke them. Acoustic anomalies in the tunnel system, nothing dangerous, just unexpected results during the investigation. Martinez nodded, but his expression suggested he wasn't buying the explanation. My hands were still shaking too badly to pack my equipment properly, and sweat continued pouring down my face in the desert heat. Whatever he'd seen in my appearance when I emerged from that tunnel, it wasn't the look of someone who'd encountered routine technical difficulties. The drive back to Phoenix took place in complete silence. I sat in the passenger seat of the government sedan, watching empty desert landscape roll past while my mind tried to process what had happened underground. The whispers had stopped the moment I reached daylight, but I could still feel them echoing in my head like a song you can't shake. Every few minutes, I found myself checking the side mirror, scanning the empty road behind us for something that might be following our vehicle. The rational part of my mind knew we were alone on this isolated stretch of highway, but some deeper instinct kept insisting that whatever I'd encountered in that tunnel wasn't finished with me. Martinez tried conversation a few times during the first hour, asking about my preliminary findings and whether I'd need additional site access for further investigation. I gave non-committal responses, claiming I needed time to analyze the data before drawing conclusions. The truth was that my scientific training had completely failed me in that underground space, leaving me with experiences that couldn't be measured or documented. The desert seemed endless, stretching in every direction without variation or landmarks. Heat waves created shimmering distortions on the asphalt ahead, making the road appear to dissolve and reform as we approached. It felt like driving through a landscape that existed outside normal reality, where impossible things might happen without explanation or consequence. My equipment bag sat in the back seat, containing rock samples and atmospheric readings that proved the tunnel was completely safe, according to every scientific parameter I could measure. Oxygen levels normal, temperature within expected ranges, no toxic gases or structural anomalies. Everything indicated a routine underground construction environment with minor acoustic irregularities. But I'd heard those whispers. I'd seen the hidden opening concealed behind communication equipment. I'd felt the overwhelming compulsion to crawl into that passage and follow voices that spoke in languages I didn't recognize. None of that would appear in any scientific report, because there was no way to document or explain what I'd experienced. Rodriguez drove with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to transporting people who'd seen classified materials. He didn't ask questions or attempt conversation, just maintained steady speed through the empty landscape while Martinez occasionally consulted files in a briefcase beside him. At the Phoenix airport, they escorted me through security and waited until my boarding announcement before leaving. The formal handoff felt like the conclusion of an assignment they were eager to finish. Martinez handed me a business card with contact information for follow-up questions, but his manner suggested he hoped there wouldn't be any. The flight to Washington gave me 3 uninterrupted hours to write a preliminary report that would satisfy the bureaucrats who'd hired me. I opened my laptop and began documenting geological findings, atmospheric conditions, and structural assessments that painted a picture of routine underground hazards. My fingers moved across the keyboard almost automatically, producing scientific language that described unstable rock formations and potential gas emissions. Standard terminology for conditions that might affect worker safety and justify permanent site closure. Nothing that would raise questions about supernatural phenomena or unexplainable acoustic anomalies. The passenger beside me glanced occasionally at my screen, probably wondering why someone would spend a cross-country flight writing technical reports about tunnel construction. I angled the laptop away from his view and continued typing, creating a document that bore no resemblance to what I'd actually experienced in that Arizona desert. Unstable sedimentary layers, potential methane emissions, structural concerns requiring extensive remediation, all true statements that happened to omit the hidden passage, the whispers, and the terrible compulsion that had nearly drawn me into that concealed tunnel. The report read like dozens of others I'd written over the years, recommending caution and additional safety measures. But between the professional paragraphs and scientific assessments, I found myself remembering Jose Garcia's hollow eyes and Bill Anderson's trembling hands. 3 experienced workers had encountered something in those tunnels that had broken their understanding of reality. Now, I knew exactly what they'd faced, and why Garcia was still mumbling about voices in a psychiatric facility. The plane descended toward Washington through evening clouds that looked completely normal and reassuring. City lights spread out below like a map of ordinary human activity, people going about their lives without knowing what existed in hidden spaces beneath the earth. I envied their ignorance more than I could express. Back at my office the following morning, I submitted the official report to Deputy Director Mills through encrypted channels. Permanent site closure recommended due to geological instability and atmospheric hazards. No personnel should return to the location without extensive safety modifications that would likely prove cost prohibitive. The bureaucratic language was precise and convincing. Mills called within 2 hours of receiving the report, asking pointed questions about specific hazards and remediation possibilities. I gave technical responses that emphasized the complexity and expense of making the site safe for human occupation. She seemed satisfied with my assessment, particularly the recommendation that all tunnel openings remain sealed indefinitely. "What about the acoustic anomalies mentioned in your preliminary notes?" she asked near the end of our conversation. "Standard properties of the rock formation," I replied, surprised by how easily the lie came. "Nothing that would affect worker safety with proper equipment and procedures." The conversation ended with her thanks for my professional assessment and a promise that my consultation fee would be processed immediately. No mention of follow-up visits or additional investigation. The entire project was being closed based on my technical recommendations, exactly as I'd intended. 2 weeks later, I received a call from Bill Anderson. He wanted to meet in person, claiming he had questions about my site visit that couldn't be discussed over the phone. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop near his apartment in Virginia, neutral ground where we could talk without official oversight. Bill looked exactly as haunted as he had in that government conference room. Maybe worse. The tremor in his hands hadn't improved, and his eyes still carried the hollow expression of someone who'd seen things that shouldn't exist. He ordered coffee but didn't drink it, just wrapped his fingers around the cup for warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. "You went down there," he said after we'd exchanged basic pleasantries. It wasn't a question. "I conducted a standard geological survey," I replied, maintaining the professional distance I'd established in my official report. "Atmospheric readings, structural assessment, nothing unusual for that type of investigation." Bill's laugh was bitter and completely without humor. "You're doing the same thing I did when they first asked me about it, trying to use normal words for something that isn't normal at all." I studied his weathered face, seeing recognition in his expression that matched what I was feeling. He knew I'd experienced something in that tunnel that couldn't be explained or documented. The careful language and technical assessments were just protective barriers we used to maintain sanity. "The whispers," Bill said quietly, leaning forward across the small table. "You heard them too." The words hit me like a physical blow. For 3 weeks, I'd been telling myself that what happened in that tunnel could be rationalized, explained through acoustic properties and psychological stress. Hearing Bill state it so directly stripped away all the scientific justification I'd built around the experience. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. "Yes, you do." Bill's hands were shaking worse now, the tremor making his coffee cup rattle against the saucer. "You know exactly what I'm talking about because you went down there and heard them calling. Just like Garcia did, just like Klein and Ramirez." We sat in silence for several minutes, surrounded by normal people having ordinary conversations about work and weather and weekend plans. The contrast between their mundane concerns and what Bill and I had experienced felt surreal, like we were visitors from a different reality trying to blend in with regular human activity. I recommended permanent closure, I finally admitted. Official reasons are geological instability and atmospheric hazards. but the site won't be reopened for any reason. Bill nodded slowly, the first expression of relief I'd seen from him since our initial meeting. That's something, at least. Maybe other people won't have to go through what we did. What happened to your crew? I asked. Garcia, Klein, the others? Garcia's still in the facility. Doctors say he might never recover enough to function normally. Bill's voice cracked slightly. Klein tried to go back to construction work, but he can't handle underground projects anymore. Ramirez. He trailed off, shaking his head. I'm sorry, I said, meaning it completely. You need to find a different line of work, Bill told me, his eyes meeting mine directly for the first time during our conversation. Don't take any more underground assignments. Trust me on this. Once you've heard those voices, you can't unhear them. They'll follow you into every tunnel, every basement, every dark space you enter. I knew he was right. Even sitting in this well-lit coffee shop surrounded by normal afternoon activity, I could feel the echo of those whispers in the back of my mind. They weren't gone, just waiting for quiet moments when my guard was down. The following week, I submitted a request for reassignment to surface projects exclusively. I cited health concerns related to underground work environments, breathing difficulties, claustrophobia, stress-related symptoms that made deep construction consulting inadvisable. All technically true, though the real reasons couldn't be included in any official documentation. My supervisor approved the request without question. 20 years of underground expertise was apparently less important than avoiding worker compensation claims for job-related health issues. I was reassigned to surface infrastructure projects, bridge assessments, and foundation analysis that kept me safely above ground level. 3 months had passed since my visit to that Arizona tunnel, and I was learning to function with the constant awareness that I'd encountered something beyond human understanding. The whispers hadn't faded with time. If anything, they'd become more persistent during quiet moments, especially late at night when traffic noise died down and the city settled into darkness. I'd tried various strategies for dealing with the ongoing psychological effects. White noise machines, sleeping medication, even consultations with therapists who specialized in work-related trauma. None of it addressed the fundamental problem. I'd heard voices that shouldn't exist, speaking from spaces that couldn't contain human speakers. My apartment had become a carefully controlled environment designed to minimize triggers that might bring the whispers closer to conscious awareness. Multiple light sources in every room, background music or television programming to fill silence, heavy curtains to block outside darkness that reminded me too much of that tunnel shaft. Sleep remained problematic. The whispers were strongest during the transition between waking and unconsciousness, when my mental defenses were weakest. I'd learned to recognize the signs, a quality of silence that suggested approaching voices, a sense of presence that had nothing to do with actual sound. On bad nights, I avoided sleep altogether. Work provided some relief through constant activity and social interaction. Surface projects required collaboration with engineers, city planners, and construction crews who maintained normal conversations about ordinary problems. Their presence helped anchor me to everyday reality, though I found myself avoiding basements, subway stations, and any environment that reminded me of confined underground spaces. But the knowledge remained, growing heavier with each passing day. Somewhere beneath the Arizona desert, behind a concealed opening in a sealed tunnel, voices continued their conversations in languages that human throats weren't designed to speak. Government officials had accepted my recommendation for permanent closure, but I knew that steel plates and security protocols weren't enough to contain what existed in that hidden passage. Bill Anderson had been right. Once you'd heard those whispers, they became part of your reality forever. They existed in the space between scientific understanding and supernatural experience, in the gap where rational explanation failed and human comprehension reached its limits. I would carry them for the rest of my life, along with the terrible knowledge that some secrets buried in the earth should never be uncovered. The worst part wasn't the ongoing psychological effects or the permanent change in my career trajectory. The worst part was knowing that somewhere in those files Mills and her colleagues maintained, other projects were probably being planned. Other tunnels would be drilled, other workers would descend into spaces where they might encounter things that would break their understanding of reality. And there was nothing I could do to warn them because the only people who would believe such warnings were those who'd already experienced it themselves. Everyone else would dismiss it as stress-related hallucinations or equipment malfunction, exactly as I would have done 4 months earlier. The cycle would continue until someone else heard those whispers and learned why some doors should never be opened.